Little Cottonwood Creek is impaired for zinc, copper, and cadmium per the Utah Division of Water Quality 303D List 2016. The sources of impairments are unknown. This is one of the study areas. A total of 89 soil samples were collected in the Cardiff Trail Toledo Bowl area in Little Cottonwood Canyon, just north of the town of Alta. Historic mine waste piles remain present in this area. Soil samples were collected on the waste piles and below the waste piles to measure mobility of metals from the waste piles. Samples were also collected above the waste piles to serve as background concentrations. In addition, samples were collected in the main gullies in the area, as well as other dispersed areas to serve as further background concentrations. Concentrations of zinc tend to be highest on the waste piles themselves, while samples below the waste piles tend to be higher than the samples above. The average concentration of zinc detected in samples collected below waste piles is higher than the average concentration of zinc detected in samples collected above, with the highest concentrations of zinc being on the waste piles themselves. Copper follows a similar trend. Copper has more extreme spikes at certain points in the study area, but is more uniform across the board. Like zinc, average concentrations of copper detected in samples collected by below waste piles is higher than the average concentration of copper detected in samples collected above waste piles, with the waste piles themselves having the highest concentrations. Cadmium is the most sporadic of the three metals. In many of the samples, cadmium was not detected at all. Concentrations of cadmium detected in samples collected below waste piles are higher than samples collected above, in which no cadmium was detected, with the highest concentrations being on the waste piles. In order to further measure mobility, 14 soil samples were collected in the main gully of the area, the headwaters of which are a mine waste pile. Concentrations of zinc and copper decreased significantly over the first 1,500 feet before beginning to steadily increase downstream. Causes for this could include a seasonal spring which is located here that may be a collapsed drainage tunnel. This indicates that copper, cadmium, and zinc are moving off of the waste piles via overland flow. However, the rate of their mobility indicates that they are not reaching Little Cottonwood Creek in significant quantities. In conclusion, heavy metals are moving off of the waste piles. However, the rate of their mobility indicates that they are not reaching Little Cottonwood Creek in large quantities and are therefore not a significant contributor to its impairment.
As stated, the creek is impaired for zinc, copper, and cadmium, which exceed the criteria for a cold water fishery. So the goal of this author was to discern from exactly where these metals were entering and polluting the creek. A total of 50 water samples were collected from the creek and its tributaries to assess the sources of impairment. The first round of samples were collected in the fall of 2019, the second in the spring of 2020, and the final in the fall of 2020. The samples were analyzed by the ICP-MS, Inductively Coupled Plasma Mass Spectrometry, at AWOL Labs and at the University of Utah's ICP-MS lab. Sample sites were selected for their relevance to potentially contaminated tributaries. Copper. A spring 2020 sample taken from Lower White Pine Creek contained the highest copper concentration of all. A sample taken from there in the fall of 2020 had much less copper, but still much more than almost any other sample. Results from downstream of the White Pine Creek confluence in the spring show no increase in copper concentration, while samples from the same location taken in the fall of 2019 and the fall of 2020 both show an increase. Of the two sampling locations in Red Pine Creek, the one closer to that tributary's headwaters contained a much higher amount of copper than most of LCC in the fall of 2020. All samples taken from the lower portion of Red Pine Creek, though, contained only small amounts of this metal. The Maybird Gulch confluence showed no evidence of copper concentration increases in any of the sampling sessions, nor did Maybird Gulch itself contain higher than average concentrations of copper than Little Cottonwood Creek samples taken nearby. Hogan Fork contains slightly more copper than LCC waters upstream of it in the fall of 2020, and a copper increase occurred downstream of its confluence with LCC. Lisa Falls contained a significant amount of this metal in the spring of 2020, and copper concentration does increase downstream of Lisa Falls in the same season. A slight increase in copper appears in the fall of 2020 sample taken just downstream of the Coal Pit Gulch confluence. Coal Pit Gulch itself was shown to have very little copper that season, however. Copper concentrations either stabilize or decrease downstream from there. Zinc. The greatest concentration of zinc is found in Lower Red Pine Creek from the spring of 2020. A sample taken immediately upstream of that confluence in the fall of 2020, though, contained a high amount of zinc. Maybird Gulch contains low levels of zinc, and the metal's concentrations decrease downstream until the Hogan Fork confluence. Hogan Fork contained higher concentrations of zinc in spring and fall of 2020 than did LCC waters upstream, and an increase in zinc concentration appears just after the Hogan Fork confluence for both the fall of 2020 and spring of 2020 samples. Lisa Falls contained levels similar to those in LCC samples taken further upstream for both spring and fall of 2020. Coal Pit Gulch itself contains low amounts of zinc for all testing sessions, but an increase in zinc is found in the sample from fall 2020 taken just downstream of that confluence. Zinc levels show no stark increases downstream. Cadmium. Red Pine Creek contained high levels of cadmium compared to Little Cottonwood Creek waters upstream. Cadmium concentrations do display some increases after the confluence with Maybird Gulch for the spring of 2020. Maybird Gulch itself contained much higher levels of cadmium than LCC waters upstream. Hogan Fork has a concentration similar to the lower levels seen in LCC, relatively insignificant amounts. Lisa Falls, too, contained low levels of this metal. Coal Pit Gulch contains high relative levels of cadmium in the spring of 2020, and the sample taken just downstream of the confluence in the same season had the same level. Cadmium levels then stabilized downstream. There is likely a major source of copper somewhere between the two sampling locations in White Pine Creek. White Pine Creek may be a serious contributor of copper to LCC, especially in the fall time. Red Pine Creek, Coal Pit Gulch, and Maybird Gulch are unlikely sources of copper. Hogan Fork may be responsible for small increases in this metal. Lisa Falls contains high levels of copper, especially in the spring, and may be responsible for an increase in that metal's concentration downstream of it. White Pine Creek is not a likely source of zinc. Despite Red Pine Creek containing an extraordinary amount of zinc, no increase was found downstream of its confluence. However, it should not be ruled out as a source. Hogan Fork and Coal Pit Gulch may be likely sources of zinc, as they are tied to an increase in zinc downstream of them. The high levels of cadmium in the first samples upstream suggest that there is a major source of cadmium coming from east of the study area, perhaps from the Alta ski area. Despite high levels of cadmium in White Pine Fork and Red Pine Fork, no increase was found downstream of their confluence with LCC, and so they may not be significant polluters. Maybird Gulch is a likely source of cadmium. There is probably an unknown source of cadmium downstream from Hogan Fork, and Coal Pit Gulch is a likely source of cadmium to LCC.